Welcome everybody to another episode of the Beyond Terrain podcast. I'm your host, Liam Dalton. We got the man again today, Jacob Diaz, the undercover biologist. I love it. This man, obviously, you guys definitely listened to the first episode together. If you haven't, go check that one out. Uh, this man does some amazing work. He's very well versed in the terrain. Um, I love chatting with this guy. He's got a good energy. I loved our last episode too, man. I had so much fun recording it. I listened back on it. It was awesome, man. I think we riff off each other pretty well. So happy to have you back on, dude.
Dude, I'm hype. Yeah, I love that episode. I love all your episodes, especially the last one with Jamie and that project. Loved it. Yeah, great energy. You guys, you always go deep, and that's what I like to do. I like to go deep into the information, help people actually see what's going on, and using their own sources against them. That's a big thing, and we're gonna do that today. So whenever you're ready, let's shoot.
Let's do it. That episode with Jamie was insane, man. He is on the forefront, and I really appreciate his work. It's so funny, like hearing arguments against Jamie and his work from sort of the other side, from the germ theory people. It's just
Yeah,
so flawed. They're like one of the funniest things that I heard was, so you disagree with the methodology used in virology. What are your thoughts on Jamie Andrews' methodology? I'm like, it's the same methodology, it just shows that it's false. I'm like, that's the
exactly.
point, that it's flawed.
Yeah, I I see the same response. I'm like, bro, there's no way these people are that dense. And the excuses they make. The proteinomics. Oh, bro, we haven't gotten there yet. But just the CPE. And the Twitter is like it's insane because they're always like, oh, CPE means virus, but it doesn't mean virus when Jamie does it. It's a different CPE. It's just hopefully at the very least this shows how just there's no logic in virology whatsoever even for people that don't understand virology, they can just look at it and be like, "Oh yeah, yeah." Sure.
The other funny response is
And there's no logic
that
with what we're talking about today.
yeah.
Go ahead.
The other funny response
Yeah.
that I hear all the time with Jamie Andrews stuff is like, you know, um, there are multiple causes to CPE. It doesn't necessarily disprove virology's use of it. But it does because I'm going through and I'm reading these studies on virology. I'm looking at them, and it's like 2% fetal bovine serum. I'm like, that is exactly what Jamie Andrews does, and half the cell culture dies. Like this is it's the
And
most obvious confounding variable that's ever been in science, and we completely overlook it. It's absurd. It's just truly absurd. But anyways,
yeah, and the fact that they're so quick to be like CPE can be caused by 4 or 5 different factors, but they never question that when they're doing their own virology studies. CPE all automatically equates to virus, but they're never going to check for the broth or some bacteria going in there, something. They're never going to question that. So it's funny that they pull all of these excuses out of the woodwork when Jamie does it, but they don't question themselves with what they do. And so I'm just seeing a bunch of hypocrisy from that side, which is not surprising. It is what it is.
it is what it is, man. That's how it goes. Yeah, Jamie's doing amazing work. I definitely go check that podcast out if you haven't listened to it, or look into
Yes.
any of Jamie Andrews' works.
Mm.
It's on the forefront. It's a pure falsification of virology. There's really no way around it. Especially if you read any of the literature on virology, you'll see that like it is exactly what Jamie Andrews is disproving, and everything relies on it. And you know, the only argument for any sort of genomics or proteomics, like it's unscientific because we're not isolating variables, first of all. But the only saving grace would be CPE, and it would be these cytopathic effect studies, right? And it's just if that's falsified, really virology stands on this. So definitely go check that out. And it's really helpful to sort of understand that as a base too, because then it applies to every single virus out there, so you can just understand that if this method is falsified, it doesn't matter if we're talking about polio, it doesn't matter if we're talking about the seasonal flu or COVID or monkeypox or any pox virus, any nonsense virus disease, all of it relies on the same methodology. And if the methodology becomes falsified, then the whole thing falls apart. But today, and we were sort of talking a little bit about this before, um, having an understanding of other potential causes is really important. And hopefully, we're going to delve into it a little bit more today. We're going to talk about three specific germ diseases today. We got Lyme, polio, and tuberculosis. Um, I know Jacob is well versed in these, so I'm really happy to have him come on and talk about these. And I think getting into the specifics, we've disproved it. Like we'll talk a little bit about that in the specifics there. Obviously, when it comes to the contagion side of things, well, if a tick's not causing Lyme, what is? Stuff like that. Um, it's really important that we get that other side, that other explanation. So that's what we're going to do today. And moving forward on this podcast, I'd love to sort of cover a lot of more specific diseases and address that alternative because where I stand with any sort of sliver of objectivity, virology's been completely falsified, and there's just no way around that. If we're going to take a true empirical point of view, and empiricism is flawed, don't get me wrong, but if we're going to use empiricism, we need to use it
Mm.
properly. And the method's been falsified, and it's just nonsense. There's absolutely no logic behind it. Virology is completely illogical, and you can hear that in the arguments used for the germ theory. Any sort of scientist that speaks on the subject adheres to ad hominem arguments, circular reasoning. They don't even know how to define circular reasoning. I was questioned on circular reasoning. I said, yeah, circular reasoning is when the conclusion affirms the premise. And they're like, no, that's not the definition. I'm like, that is exactly what circular reasoning is
It's
actually.
literally
So
the
there's no
definition.
understanding. It's absurd, man. It's absurd. All right, so Jacob, I want to give you the floor a little bit. I just want to hear you go off and maybe start us off. Where's the best place to start with this sort of discussion? Let's start with Lyme and we'll just sort of
Oh,
take it from there.
of course, I would gladly take the baton. So, Lyme disease is unfortunately becoming the long COVID, if you will. Everyone wants to blame everything on Lyme disease. Stealth Lyme, chronic Lyme, acute Lyme, whatever. People are going to blame all of their symptoms to Lyme disease. And I just finished right now my Lyme podcast, which will come out shortly after this podcast. But I was reading all this information and I was just like, wow, these people really duped everybody. So with Lyme disease specifically, there are 50 symptoms associated with Lyme disease. 50, 5-0. So right then and there, your case definition, your differential diagnosis, everything is completely out the window. You can call anything Lyme disease at any given time. And that's what they want people to do. Because when you create such a broad diagnosis, you can get anybody to take any drug you want. So when people are coming to me, to you, to anybody in the terrain camp, oh, but what about I have Lyme disease? I was diagnosed with X disease this time. They're automatically associating that it must be Lyme because that's what they're told it is. So what I did, as with any other person should logically do, is go to the evidence yourself and see if they actually proved that there was ever a spirochete bacteria causing Lyme. So that's what they say. They say a bacteria is in the tick. The tick bites you, and in that salivary gland, the bacteria goes into your bloodstream and wreaks havoc. That's what they say. But is that the case? So it all started in the 70s in old Lyme, Connecticut, where people had like inflammation, arthritis, malaise. They had these odd symptoms that were very similar to symptoms in Europe during that time. William Bergdorfer is the guy's name. In 1982, he stated that he found the causal factor in the disease, which was namely the spirochete bacteria, which was named after him, Borrelia burgdorferi. So when you look at these studies, and we'll talk about a couple of them, you read them, you're like, when did they ever prove that this germ was the cause? They say at very best, it's an association. And that's what we see a lot with germ theory, not even with virology as a whole. They're just straight up lying. There's no virus. With the germ theory or microbiology, you do have a germ. It's there. It's associated maybe with a disease process, but it's not the cause. Because we talk about Koch's postulates all the time. If you find the germ in healthy people and you can't find it in every single case of disease, logically it cannot be the cause. It's something else going on there, and the germ is simply responding. So in the source study I mentioned from after old Lyme in Connecticut. They took 126 ticks and evaluated them. This was out of Shelter Island, New York, and only 60% of them had a positive for the spirochete bacteria. So right then and there, you're like, okay, so all these ticks supposedly carrying Lyme disease, only 60% of them had the bacteria. So what exactly is going on here? And then they did a supposed contagion study where they took rabbits and they tied them up. It was 8 rabbits. And they took 300 ticks, all with supposed Lyme, and they had them bite their stomach just incessantly. And right then and there, that's not a controlled experiment, which we can talk about experiments. I mean, you would want 3 groups in that experiment. The first group would be ticks biting the rabbits that don't have the bacteria. The second group would be the rabbits simply being allowed to be bitten by ticks that don't have the bacteria. And the third one would be just the bacteria. So you would want 3 groups: the bacteria, ticks with no bacteria, ticks with bacteria. They didn't do that. They just tied these poor rabbits up and had their abdomens bitten to death. And none of the rabbits came back positive for Lyme. None of them. 0 out of 8. And I'm like, okay, there's no freaking way they use this as proof, but they do use it as proof. And in the ticks, it was 300 ticks they did. It was like, I forget specifically in the study, but a lot of them didn't even have the spirochete in them. And then you have the rabbits, none of them testing positive for the bacteria. So where did you prove that there was a contagious organism in the tick leading to disease in the rabbits? They never proved it. What they did was they designed an antibody test. And that antibody test came back as positive in the rabbits that were bitten to near death. And what's funny is that the rash, so people will say, oh, I developed a rash for Lyme disease, the erythema migrans, that's what it's called. It took the rabbits almost 3 months to develop the rash. So it's like, you don't even know if the rash is associated with the tick at that point. It's been 3 months and none of them came back positive. So you design an antibody test to then say, oh yeah, it must be specific to Lyme disease, even though they test healthy animals and healthy people, and lo and behold, antibodies come back positive. So right then and there, you're like, you don't know what's going on here. And later on in the post I made that I use as reference, there are so many studies where they cite, yeah, high antibody levels for Lyme disease doesn't mean anything because many times they don't even have any symptoms. Or they do have symptoms and very low antibodies, or healthy people have antibodies. Unhealthy people have high antibodies. It's all over the place. So this is what they designed as the indirect proof that there was a supposed contagious organism. And then later on, Bergdorfer did another study that cited in an encyclopedia called Lyme Disease and Relapsing Fever. So they cited a paper, it was done in 1982 and 1983, where they isolated a pathogen from a human that was cultured from a black-legged deer. And this was out of Long Island and Westchester. So it was a bunch of people that supposedly had Lyme disease. It was 36 in total, right? So when you hear this, you're like, okay, they isolated a pathogen. They must have proved that there was an actual bacteria causing this illness. So 36 patients. Guess how many tested positive for this bacteria? 2. It was 2 out of 36 people tested positive for this supposed pathogen. And this paper to this day is stated to be the proof that, quote, that they defined the bacterial's etiological role in the disease. Even though 34 out of 36 Lyme patients did not have the bacteria. But what they do is they make excuses, and this creates an unfalsifiable theory. They actually stated that the bacteria in layman were good at hiding. They literally said that the bacteria hid, that there maybe wasn't enough to see in the sample. And I'm thinking logically, it's like, okay, if they have Lyme disease, which is supposedly a bacterial illness, why can't you find the bacteria? And a human is so much bigger than a bacteria. Do you know how much bacteria would need to invade a person to cause illness? Yet there's no bacteria to be found, and they're just hiding? Like, that's just unfalsifiable. You can't disprove it because all they do is make excuses. And all they do is make up a story. That's what they do. And then later on in the slides, I go into studies that showed that not only were the antibody tests completely useless, and this was actually stated by Bergdorfer, William Bergdorfer, the guy they named the bacteria after. He said that serological studies based on Lyme disease have to be completely redone because not only are they based on shoddy evidence, but it's based on people that already know the results of their experiment. So they're doing it for money. So he said that, and a bunch of other studies agree, but they're mainly about antibiotics. And that goes into what people want to talk about regarding what really is the cause of Lyme disease. What happens is you have somebody that may or may not be bitten by a tick, right? Well, fine. Ticks are bugs. They're a bit of a nuisance, but it is what it is. Bugs bite you. Most bugs have foreign proteins in their salivary glands, and in those salivary glands, they have enzymes. Sometimes they may be toxic, maybe not. But once that gets into your dermal area, into your bloodstream, your body's intelligent design is to remove it because it doesn't belong in there. So now you get inflammation. You may develop a rash. Fine, whatever. They claim erythema migrans is specific, even though we know, and many studies cited in my post state that it's not specific. If you look up pictures of erythema migrans, they look basically indistinguishable from regular bug bites or even eczema for that matter. So you can't use that as a proof. So what you have here is a bug that bites you. Fine, it is what it is. Instead of going to your home and just doing regular natural protocols, whether to put some raw honey on there, let it drain, put some bentonite clay, activated charcoal, oregano oil, whatever you can do, they don't do that. They run to the hospital. The doctors, since they don't know what they're doing, they'll claim it's Lyme because a tick was involved. And then they'll put you on a 2 to 12 week cycle of antibiotics, different antibiotics like doxycycline, amoxicillin, all these different things. And what do antibiotics do? They acidify the heck out of your tissues, the interstitial fluids. They destroy your adrenals. They destroy your microbiome. And now you get worse. Now you get weaker. What previously was just a simple cut that may lead to certain flu-like symptoms for a day or two has now led to a chronic illness that had been exacerbated because of the antibiotics that you continually take. And then they want to blame the actual tick because it started at that day. And what's funny is that there's a disease called tick toxicosis or tick paralysis that when you look at the symptoms, they're literally the same symptoms as Lyme disease. The problem is that if there's not a tick still on you, they're not going to diagnose it as tick toxicosis. So the tick still has to be on you in the hospital for them to do it. But since most people logically will just remove it, they're going to think it's Lyme disease. And that's a big what? It's ridiculous, really. And a lot of the studies too, when they're talking about antibiotic use, they'll say that antibiotics performed just as well or worse than placebo. And most of these studies are actually telling you to not do long-term antibiotic use, despite what many medical authorities will say. So the information is there. I maybe cited like 15, 20 PMIDs in this post, but people don't know about this because they just go to the doctor and the doctor says, take these antibiotics. Why? Because they say the bacteria was proven to be the cause when it never was. And now you have a chronic illness that gets worse. And now you want to develop antibody tests to test people when healthy people, unhealthy people test positive all the time. And what's funny with the antibody test is they admit that say you had a tick bite from like 2-3 years ago, antibody tests can still come back positive as if you have a current infection from 3 years ago. And now they still give you more antibiotics, even though the issue is not there anymore. So that's another issue of relying on these tests that have never, again, been proven. And the two final studies I cite in the post, and these are, again, this is really funny because people just simply don't know these exist. In this study, they tested for Borrelia burgdorferi in the isolated blood of patients with different forms of Lyme disease. 1 out of 53 patients had Borrelia burgdorferi in their lymphatic system. So this was Lyme disease affecting the lymphatic system. 6 out of 176 had a positive bacteria test for Lyme disease associated with the brain. 1 out of 13 found bacteria in Lyme arthritis, and 3 out of 200 saw it in their rash. So there is no association whatsoever. The percentages are literally all below 7%. It's absolutely asinine that you can think that this has anything to do with Lyme disease. And then the next one, they took blood specimens of like 100 people with Lyme disease and cultured for the bacteria. 2 people out of 100 had a positive culture. So, meaning 98 people with supposed Lyme disease did not have the bacteria in their blood. And then they go into different like subsets of these people where 1 out of 7 were found in their brains, like only 8 of them were found in their skin, 8 out of 31. So there's nothing there. There's literally nothing, no evidence to prove that the germ is the cause of this issue. What I think is the issue is one, the bug bite that has enzymes in there that are not supposed to be in your body. Your body's expelling it, and instead of using your natural herbal concoctions or fasting or whatever, you run to the doctor and you take antibiotics, which then gives you a chronic illness. The other factor is the inability to diagnose people correctly as doctors, because it's been known that Lyme disease is kind of like the end diagnosis doctors rely on because they don't know what's wrong with you. They'll just say, oh, it must be Lyme because you've seen 20 or 30 different specialists. We don't know what's wrong. Must be Lyme. Here, take an antibiotic. And then you're screwed. So I don't even know how many Lyme disease diagnoses are even associated with a tick bite, because Dr. Harvey Bigelson in his book, he mentioned so many patients that were given this diagnosis and none of them had a tick bite. So they're just saying it must be Lyme because we don't know what it is. And then people in my comments, in whatever the case, they'll say, I know Lyme is real because it was a bioweapon. And I'm like, oh, okay, again with this bioweapon nonsense. And what they do is they cite these like 2 different instances. One of them was out of Fort Detrick, where they were actually trying to put like toxic cultures of bacterial waste or whatnot into ticks. The problem is the first cases were not in Maryland, where Fort Detrick is, nowhere in the area. They were in upstate New York and Connecticut. So why are they in Connecticut, upstate New York, or Long Island, or Europe, but not in the immediate area of Fort Detrick and the immediate state? That makes no sense. And then the very first cases of supposed Lyme were out of Europe, and there was no bioweapon there. So what happened there? Was there a bioweapon agency happening with ticks in Europe, or is it just complete coincidence? It's coincidence. The other thing was people were saying they used ticks in Vietnam to get people sick or whatever. What they did was they tried to bioengineer ticks to eat the crops so the Vietnamese soldiers couldn't hide. That was the idea. But you didn't see any Lyme disease proliferate after the Vietnamese War. You didn't see any of that. What you did see were people coming back sick because of the Agent Orange and all the standing in stagnant water for 8 or 10 hours, being bombarded by mortars and stuff like that. You got people sick from that. You didn't get sick from any Lyme disease, which we didn't see in Vietnam. So the whole bioweapon angle that people take, to me, is just more excuses because there is no actual proof that bacteria is the cause. The cause is probably the antibiotics, really. And if your body really went into like a chronic detox process after a bug bite, I'm looking at your overall health, because a healthy person can probably deal with a bug bite pretty well. Unless you're like really allergic to maybe a bee sting, for instance, your body's designed to handle that sort of stressor. If you just straight up start decaying after a bug bite, you were already almost there to very poor health, which shows me that you have to reverse all of that and listen to your terrain. You're not getting enough nutrition. You're not opening up your detox pathways. and you just started deteriorating. And that's what it is. That's really what it is. Lyme disease has nothing to do with the bacteria. And I even hesitate to say that it has something to do with ticks because, again, most people with Lyme disease aren't even bitten by a tick. So that's that.
Amazing, brother. Amazing. You know, I couldn't agree more with your perspective on like the true cause here. Because one, you mentioned there's 50 symptoms, right? So the diagnostics are all over the place. You're diagnosing it's the replacement for calling something an idiopathic illness. So an idiopathic is like when the doctor doesn't know what's called. Now you just call it Lyme, right? It's like the cop out. It's the
Mhm.
scapegoat. You know, now everything can be
Yeah.
categorized as Lyme. So anything that we don't know, we slap that on. So that's one thing, right? And diagnostics have terrible sensitivity and specificity overall. So we don't like the false positives, the false negatives are through the roof with uh, purely diagnostics. That's why we go to the lab. And then you go to the antibody test. Again, terrible specificity because antibodies are non-specific. Anybody with high antibodies in their system, so anybody that is sick is going to test positive for any antibody test out there. We saw that with the antigen test, the COVID test, right? PCR was just random. Anybody could test positive because of the high cycle threshold. And with antibodies,
Mm-hmm.
anybody that was sick was testing positive, but people who were generally healthy, had no symptoms, weren't testing positive on that. So there was a huge disconnect there. And so the diagnostics are an absolutely huge factor here. One thing that I find interesting with
Mm-hmm.
uh, Lyme, I've been seeing it in my field, like doing sort of counseling psychology, been seeing a lot of connection to trauma, right? And so within and not to say that trauma causes Lyme, but trauma causes chronic illnesses, 100% chance, right? And so the problem is that there are so many chronic illnesses that are now diagnosed as Lyme, right? So now these illnesses that are caused by trauma are being diagnosed as Lyme because the medical establishment and practitioners have a lot of trouble with people with chronic illness because a lot of chronic illness is caused by
Mm-hmm.
trauma. You know, your 15-minute doctor appointment is not enough to figure that out. So the medical establishments and practitioners and
Exactly.
doctors are unaware that trauma plays a significant role in chronic illness. And so and you understand the frustration because if you are an allopathic doctor and you are really benevolent and you care about people's health and maybe you are just under the spell that all the antibiotics work and the science is good, whatever, it is very frustrating to have somebody who come in with chronic pain and nothing works. No antibiotics work, nothing works. You just give them opioids to help them numb out their trauma and so their chronic symptoms kind of go away. But then you just call them pill push or pill seekers and whatever. So you know
Exactly.
it's kind of sad because you have these people with a chronic condition due to trauma. Now, if they did some proper trauma work, which we've discussed a little bit here, and there are some interesting modalities out there. We've discussed holographic manipulation therapy, something I'm looking at getting trained in right now, actually. EMDR, I'm taking a course next week on it. There are so many different ways to approach trauma. Hell, even psychedelic ceremonies with a shaman, or there are so many different ways to approach trauma. It's completely individual. There's no one way to do it, no wrong way to do it, but we're not dealing with people's trauma. And so that's a big thing that I'm seeing with Lyme lately is this all these chronic conditions that we don't know are getting grouped into. It's funny because it's like arthritis, right? It's like arthritis can be considered Lyme. That doesn't even make any sense. Like that is pure nonsense.
It
So
doesn't make any
maybe
sense.
it's just nonsense. Like how are we considering another illness to be caused by it completely falls apart. It just completely falls apart, and there's no logic behind it. There's no science behind it. Because when you look into these papers, you're looking, wow, there's really no science. So that brings me to my final point, the last thing I want to mention, and it's the problem with the literature. It's the problem with the literature, and it's citation errors.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a video on this on YouTube, and I'll link it down below. But it's because it's really really important. People don't talk about this enough. But even the literature admits that citation errors are really problematic. Citation errors include citing from introductions or abstracts, or citing a citation. You're not supposed to do that either. A good citation, you should cite from the results of the previous paper. You should not cite a paper that's citing another paper. So when people say, oh, we've isolated Lyme, and they cite some random paper, well, if you dig deep into these papers, you go 10 papers back and you get to the original studies that Mr. Diaz is speaking about here. So, and then you realize, well, it's a fact not found. We've actually never isolated any of this.
Mhm.
So you go down the rabbit hole in these papers, you go down through the references, and you can keep going back further and further and further. It's like in virology, we've isolated this virus. You go back 10 papers and you realize that there's never been a single paper cited in this whole string of references that actually talked about any sort of isolation. So this is largely the problems with scientific literature. The citation errors are complete nonsense, and they're in every single paper. Any paper published in the last 50 to 100 years has citation errors, absolutely guaranteed. Without fail, you could bring me any paper and I will find you not one, but probably half of the citations in the paper, at least. Sometimes it's probably like 90 to 95% of the citations are errors. A good paper nowadays is probably 50%. So I don't know, Jacob. Do you have anything else to add? Because to me, it just seems like
Nah, man,
with a sliver of objectivity, I don't know how you can conclude that this is caused by a bacteria.
dude. Yeah. Let leave cook. All right, he is saying everything I would say, just in probably more calmer. But I completely agree, man. It's like it's the same thing with virology. You mentioned it, like how many times I was reading a COVID-19 paper, and it cites a paper that uses the very paper I'm reading right now, and I'm like, what the? How is that possible? How are you citing a paper that did the same thing? And are you checking? Are you actually looking? Which shows that the peer review process is an utter joke. It is a joke. How many studies get retracted every year for straight up lying? And how many studies have actually gotten published, even though they were blatantly fake studies, to see if the process is actually liable? It's not. And that's why I'm so sick and tired of people. Where's the study? Where's the study? Do you know what the peer review process is? It's a popularity contest. Oh, I like this guy. I'm not going to read the paper. I'm just going to check you're good. That's what it is. It doesn't mean jack. What Jamie Andrews is doing, for instance, when that gets published, he's probably not going to be able to get it peer reviewed because they don't want to peer review a study that disproves virology. Why would they? That's their job. So
Livelihood. Yeah.
it's the whole thing. It's the lack of independent variable, the lack of control experiments, the lack of logic, the lack of being forefront on your science. Because I didn't mention it before, but Borgdorfer, he in his study, he even said we may have found the bacteria that is found to be the etiological factor of the disease. May,
Maybe,
that is right there.
maybe.
He doesn't know. He is admitting, yeah, we may maybe, but that guess what? That maybe by people who appeal to authority has not led to millions of people becoming victims to the very system that creates sickness. And it's just, yeah, I hate it. I freaking hate it. but I echo everything you said. It's a joke. So
It's really interesting, because when you do go back, and you read like Koch's postulates, perfectly logical set of postulates. I agree completely with these postulates. I believe that they're completely logical, and I think that if they could be reproduced in reality in an experiment, I would be a germ theorist till the day I die. But the problem is that even
yeah,
though these postulates are extremely logical, one, they're taught to university students. Every university class that I had that had ever mentioned microbes introduced Koch's postulates as the fundamental experiment that proves all of this, but there is not one paper out there that adheres to Koch's postulates. And now we have virologists and microbiologists saying, it was just a primitive understanding. We don't use Koch's postulates anymore. We even, it's so funny to hear virologists speak of this and then go take a university course on microbiology and they're teaching you about Koch's postulates. And they don't teach you about Rivers' review of Koch's postulates for viruses. They do not. I've never heard Rivers' name, Thomas Rivers. His name was never mentioned in my university career. Not once was it mentioned. And it's like, first of all, we got away from logic with rivers. We did, but why are we not talking about it? Why are we not introducing university students to this? Because that's where it begins. Because then it doesn't get any better when you go into your master's or into medical school or do your PhD. It doesn't get any better. That it doesn't change based off these introductory classes. So it's systemic, and I mean, we're sort of getting a little bit off topic here, but I think it all sort of plays into the fraud that is being perpetrated here.
Yeah.
It all plays a role. So I don't know. I think we beat this dead horse enough. I mean, I'm sure there are questions that the listeners might have, and that could be probably an interesting follow up discussion. So, if you do have questions about any of this, I'm sure Jacob would love to come back and discuss them further.
Of
So,
course.
and maybe we
Of
could answer them
course.
on live. So, if you do have questions, send either Jacob or I a DM, and we'll do something where we answer questions if we get enough of them. If not, we'll probably answer them individually. But if we get a good collection, we should probably do that. That would probably be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be awesome. And because I mean, Lyme disease is a big thing. It really is, and
It
a
is.
lot of people. And I love that you mentioned the trauma angle because chronic disease can really be. I mean, a multitude of factors. It can be. I mean, I learned about freaking out. What's the word? I'm blanking off here. It was scar tissue. There you go. Scar
Yeah,
tissue
scar
can
tissue.
lead to
Yeah,
chronic
the big old
disease that
C.
can inevitably lead to depression because you can't heal. Trauma, obviously, all of those emotions not being able to be released, contained in your tissues. That's chronic disease. Vaccinations from the second you're born, you're given 70 plus shots in the first 5 years of life. Of course, that can be an effect. The crappy food that we are eating nonstop, that's going to be an effect. So chronic disease is getting worse, not because the germs are adapting to hurt us, but because we are getting further and further away from nature and further away from being able to handle our own emotions. Can that be linked to the advent of social media and the addiction to technology? Maybe. Maybe that's what they want us. They want us to be almost robotic, almost not emotional. So we can't handle our emotions. So all of that is connected. And once you realize that your health is really up to you and your decisions, you can stop blaming everybody else and take charge and heal yourself. Because that the one thing that we both know that they do not want you to do is rely on yourself for health. And that goes with Lyme disease too, because they want you, even the holistic doctors. I'm
Yeah, a
even
lot of
going
them.
against our own crowd right now. There's so many holistic Lyme doctors that do basically the same thing allopathic doctors do with regards to Lyme. Attack this, attack this, attack this. Stop it with the attacking. The body's not attacking itself. It's trying to get to one point. You help lead it to that point. Yeah, so I mean, we can go
Again,
on to
my last point, we
tuberculosis or whatever.
absolutely
Yeah.
no, no, no,
Yeah.
no. Because this is important. I think that it's fine. Like, to be explicitly clear, if somebody is given a Lyme diagnosis and you have symptoms and you are suffering, I hope we've made it clear that we're not saying that you're not suffering and that you're not going through something that is challenging and that you're not in a state of repair. Some might call it disease, right? Um, I hope that's abundantly clear that we're saying that we're not trying to deny anyone's reality here either. We're saying that the diagnosis that's given, first of all, will not lead you to better outcomes because the allopathic way is to give you antibiotics, which is not going to lead to better health. Even though, for the most part, holistic doctors, like Jacob's pointing out here, they do their protocols where it's kill, kill, kill. It's not about nourishment. It's not about minimizing toxicity. It's nothing like that, right? So that is a true protocol if it's caused by some sort of physical anomaly. It's very important that if you are struggling with any sort of chronic conditions, that you explore the psychological connection, which cannot be done in a 15-minute consultation, which cannot be taught to you necessarily in a course. Maybe some courses, but it
Maybe.
depends. It depends. It depends what they're targeting. If it's a course on how to heal your trauma and how to, or you go to a retreat or something like that, that can be very helpful too. But it's not kill, kill, kill. Anyways, let's move on to polio, Mr. Diaz. Let's move on to
Okay,
polio
bet.
because I love polio and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts. And I'll have lots to say on this afterwards too. We might not get the TB today, but that's all right. We'll have another episode for you folks. So let's hear about polio first, because so interesting.
Of course. So polio. It's said to be obviously a virus, and a virus that we as amazing humankind have eradicated with the advent of vaccinations. The problem is, as many people will properly surmise, it's not a virus, and no, we did not eradicate the pathology with the use of vaccinations. If anything, we made it a lot worse. Now, I'm not saying polio hasn't gone down in the United States, because it has. Why it has is not because of a virus and not because of a vaccine. So when you go back into the history, and I cite work a lot from What Really Makes You Ill, Virus Mania, The Contagion Myth, a lot of these books really go deep into this issue, is we really started seeing a lot of neurological pathologies when we started introducing neurotoxins into our environment. Oh my God. How did he think about that? It's so crazy. Neurotoxins lead to whoa, exactly. It's more heavy metals, more neurotoxins, leading to exactly what you would expect. So you have the use of pesticides like Paris green, things like lead arsenate, copper, DDT, all of these things that were being used on a day-to-day basis for wallpapers, for paint, for dyes. And a lot of these insecticides specifically were designed to cause neurological damage to bugs. So if it causes it to one natural organism, what makes you think it's not going to cause it to another natural organism? So what I hear a lot of people talk about is, oh, but DDT wasn't used here and it wasn't used here. Why did polio happen? Because everybody was using lead arsenic. Everybody was using some formulation of a neurotoxin in their day-to-day life, or primarily in the use of insecticides used in farms and all that stuff. So you had this, especially pre and post World War II era, all of these household insecticides and cropicides really that were being used and leading to pathology in people that were living in the whole area. You even look back, you can see YouTube videos of kids in like these small towns, and these cars being like driven really slowly, of just straight up spraying DDT in their face. Huge like wafts of smoke of DDT, lead arsenate, all these things being sprayed right into the children's face, into people's face, and they wonder why in a week they can't walk. I mean, it's right there. So we've always known as humans that heavy metal poisoning causes lesions to form, causes neurological pathology. But with polio, it just somehow wasn't a factor, because again, with the virus model, you can push germs, you can push vaccines, you can push antivirals, antibiotics, the most you want for a big profit. Even though doctors Morton Biskin and Ralph Scobie testified in the United States Congress that the use of central nervous system poisoning, specifically caused by DDT, lead arsenate, and all these things, were the primary cause of polio. And it's a very famous graph. You can find it on Contagion Myth. But the incidence of DDT and polio were neck and neck. And of course, people are going to say, oh, correlation doesn't equal causation. Yes, that's why you have to test for things like DDT and lead arsenate. And you have, and you found they're very neurologically toxic. So why are we denying this very clear correlation? The more the United States used these products in the forms of household insecticides or in crops, the more polio went up. And then once they conveniently were outlawing the use of these things, putting restrictions on them, now you saw polio go all the way down. It's not a coincidence. And many investigations into this whole thing have been done. Like Dr. Biskin wrote in 1945, against the advice of people in the pharmacology, the companies and all that, that DDT was released in the United States and other countries for general use by the public as an insecticide. It was even known by 1945 that DDT is stored in the body fat of mammals and appears in the milk. With this foreknowledge, the series of catastrophic events that followed the most intensive campaign of mass poisoning in known human history should have not surprised the experts. Yet, far from admitting a causal relationship so obvious, virtually the entire apparatus of communication, lay and scientific alike, have devoted to denying, concealing, suppressing, distorting, and making attempts to convert into its opposite. So, in short, what he was saying was the evidence was always there. It was always known that these compounds were highly toxic and caused neurological poisoning. They purposely made it hard for people to find out. And of course, everything leads back to the money. Who was making these insecticides? Obviously, the companies that make insecticides and things that are sprayed in crops to farmers. So they have a stake to lose. They're making millions upon millions of dollars. And then you have the advent of polio leading to what? Vaccinations, more people going to the hospitals. And that is what? The pharmaceutical industry. So now you have two major industries that help the United States economy extraordinarily, benefiting hugely from polio. Of course, nobody's going to know about the connection between polio and DDT. So when you look at the contagion studies and all that, I made a post with like 100 plus failed contagion studies. Many of them were done with polio. So one of the studies, they actually took milk and they seeded like polio particles from tissues and they fed them to people. Literally just feed them like a normal, like a human, like a baby human with a little applesauce. And literally nobody developed polio. Nobody got sick. And this again, no one knows about. And they've done so many experiments using polio mush, injecting it into people, feeding it into people, and nothing ever happens. What they always use as proof, though, is they did an experiment with two monkeys, and you hear so many people reference this. Oh, they showed it was a contagious organism. They tied two monkeys down and they bored a hole in one of the monkeys' head. They put an immense amount of polio goop. So we're talking like spinal fluid and the ground up muscles and all that injected directly into the brain of a monkey, and it gets paralyzed and dies. And they're like, oh man, we just found a contagious organism there. Was any isolated virus found? Absolutely not. Was any independent variable tested for? Absolutely not. Was any control experiment with simply saline water done? Absolutely not. And that study is used as proof. And then later on, what we have is the advent of the polio vaccine, which was done by Jonas Salk, who John Enders actually stole his virus culture method from him. So it was he figured out essentially that with virus cultures you can use different tissues. You can use a brain tissue to a kidney, for instance, something like that. So John Enders copied that using it with his measles experiment, which is used as the foundation for virology today. So Jonas didn't like that Enders took his method. So what Jonas did was that he took notice of the experiment and then used chicken fibroblast cells along with human embryonic kidney cells. He took aborted fetal tissue and he took chicken tissue. He combined them with a bunch of different toxins like glutaraldehyde, for instance, along with polio disease tissue, and he used that as the vaccine. He never tested it. He said he tested it on his family, even though there's no evidence to suggest he did. What we do find, though, is once that vaccine that included monkey kidney cells, aborted fetal tissue, foreign disease tissue of all types, polio tissue, formaldehyde, and glutaraldehyde, once that started going into the masses, what happens? Polio blows up. Is that a coincidence? Absolutely not. You're injecting the very toxins that lead to polio into the blood of a person, and you're injecting this tissue that has all this waste directly into the neurological part of the body. So of course polio is going to skyrocket. So people that claim that he eradicated polio simply just don't know what they're talking about, because it actually rose when the vaccine came about. What happened was that they started outlawing the diagnosis of polio following the vaccine going to the public. So the American Medical Association actually threatened to revoke the license of a bunch of doctors that were categorizing polio as polio. So now you see polio just go down, 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 down. Very similar to what we see with COVID, where they lessen the cycle threshold for the PCR. Now all of a sudden, COVID's gone. It's the same playbook. So now you have diseases like Guillain-Barré, Bell's palsy, ALS, MD, MS, acute flaccid paralysis, all being created because polio could not be diagnosed. So now all of these diseases that have very similar pathologies, very similar symptomatology, neurological issues, having a hard time walking, having, spasms and seizures, things that link to neurological issues. You have all of that coming about following them make delegitimizing polio as an actual diagnosis. And now what we have here today in modern day, world, in India, for instance, you have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that is pushing polio vaccines almost annually. And what you have in India now, I think I put it here. It was something like between, let's see here, 491,000 Indian children paralyzed due to the polio vaccine. I think that was between 2000 and 2017. Most of them, at the very least, founded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, pushing these shots to people. So, did polio become eradicated? No. We stopped using DDT for the most part. We stopped using all these heavy metal poisons in our household. We really stopped mandating the polio vaccine, and they made it harder and harder for you to diagnose polio to people as an MD. So that's why it went down. Vaccines did not eradicate polio. Polio was caused primarily by central nervous system poisoning due to heavy metals like arsenic, like DDT, like all these things, because they were designed to cause neurological issues to bugs. And that's a big issue now, what we see with all products. I mean, then and now, they're not looking to see if it's safe for humans. They're just doing animal testing, and they're like, okay, some of the animals were fine, whatever. So it must be the same for humans. But humans are not going to react the same way as an animal would if it's safe. If it's designed to cause, say, seizures in dogs, and then you see dog owners just die of seizures, are you not going to make a connection there that it must be something in the compound? Or are you just going to try to profit off of it? I also made like another polio post that covered primarily the polio experiments. And much of these experiments, I won't go like too detailed in them. I have an episode about it and a post about it. But they would essentially take not only polio matter, we're talking like spinal fluid, we're talking blood, we're talking all these fluids and muscles put together. They would take polio fecal matter, like literal poop from people that had supposed polio, and they would inject all of that into the stomachs or the brains of suckling mice. Suckling mice, so baby mice that were grown in a lab, they would shove all of that into their brain or their abdomen. And to make it short and sweet, some of them died, many of them were fine. So what they did were in that experiment, they claimed that it was a polio-like virus because a lot of them didn't even get sick. So instead of blaming, or not blaming, instead of conceding that you failed, they're just going to double down and say it must be like another virus. So it was in this study, like only some of them became paralyzed. Again, some of them did die because they're suckling mice. But in like older mice or whatever that were healthier, a lot of them didn't get sick. So a lot of these studies that are proffered up as proof, you see the same exact theme. They're taking unpurified polio gook that contains not only added chemicals, but all the bodily waste products that aren't removed, including whatever lead arsenic or DDT that's in the tissues. And then you're just injecting it into suckling mice, into monkeys, and you're just claiming an effect when in actuality, there's nothing there, just toxic goop. It's really just animal torture, if we're being completely honest. And a lot of these samples really were taken from children that lived in farm areas. So when I looked into this study, it was a child TT and child KH. They used just their letters, and both of those children lived on a farmland in upstate New York. That same farmland was obviously being sprayed with DDT and all these insecticides. So now the children just start getting sick. And the study actually pointed out that polio disappeared by the end of summer. Very funny how that works. It just a virus just decides I'm gonna be hanging out between August and September, And then once we're over, I'm going to be leaving at the end of September. Is it really that, or is it the use of all these heavy metal insecticides and all that? And the very same study I talked about before with the monkeys that is still used today, and I still see it people bringing it up as proof, just to get even more like clear with the details on this. It was done by Landsteiner and Popper. So they chose to take again diseased spinal marrow from a lame 9-year-old boy. They chopped it up, they dissolved it into water, and then they injected 1 to 2 whole cups into the abdominal cavities of 2 test monkeys. They also did it into their brain. One died, and again, the other one became paralyzed. Their study is obviously plagued with a bunch of problems. For one, the glop that they poured into the animal was not even infectious, since the paralysis didn't appear in the monkeys and guinea pigs given the alleged virus soup to drink. So what they saw was when they gave this polio goop to drink to the monkeys and the guinea pigs, none of them became paralyzed. None of them. They had to literally inject all this stuff into their body, which I'm sure you've talked about on the podcast in the past. That is not a natural form of infection. So it cannot indicate something that's happening in nature. No, nobody is getting polio and just shoving it directly into the lungs, into the blood. That's not happening. But that's what they do in their experiments. So, in that, shortly after, researchers Simon Flexner and Paul Lewis experimented with a comparable mixture, injecting this mixture into monkey brains. They brewed the new soup, they tied up the monkeys, they put it into their brains. The monkeys did become ill, and that is proof that there was a virus that caused the monkeys' paralysis. And that is then proof that polio was a supposed virus, even though, as we talked about before, there never really was an isolated polio virus. They would take this soup, culture it, and this was again around the time of John Enders. They would culture it, nuke it to death. They see particles form, and like, peace, we did our job. Now let's take all of that and make a vaccine out of it. And now we make people sick. And then we're going to make it difficult for them to diagnose. So now we can hide the fact that it was actually the vaccine. It's just polio was the one that got me into this whole thing because I saw how much fraud was actually happening in the polio era and how they basically did the same exact thing with COVID. This very same thing. And it's yeah, that's polio for you. It's DDT, lead arsenate, and that's why we don't see it anymore. Because America was at least smart enough to stop using all of those things. And that's why it still affects, building nations like India, for instance, because they still use those things to this day. So, and when you hear, before I end, when you hear people in the news, especially, they'll say polio is on the rise. Why? They're testing your poop in your tap water. It's utterly ridiculous. It's the same thing. They're using PCR to test for sequences in your tap water or in your poop, and then they'll use that as a way to say polio is coming back. Take this polio vaccine. There was never a virus. It was always neurological poisoning. Steer clear from neurological poisoning, and you're never going to develop polio. And that's what I tell people whenever they have neurological issues, whatever the case may be, nerves or whatever. I'm looking at 2 things mainly. Obviously the neurological poisoning, the toxicity level. So not only that, but blue light, not being able to get enough sunlight, all the household cleaning things that I grew up with that are really toxic for you. On top of that, are you getting enough fat in your diet, like collagen and cholesterol, which all of that binds your nerves? Myelin sheaths are made out of fat. Are you getting enough of that to help your nerves heal? Or are you staying clear of fat? You're including all that crappy stuff in your environment. And now you're shocked that you have neurological pathologies at 40 because you're not getting enough sunlight too. You're not grounding. You're not moving. Yet they want to blame polio. They want to blame a virus they never showed to exist instead of the very things that led to their terrain deteriorating. I it's like it just gets tiring just having to repeat this. Your health is your responsibility. The symptoms are a clue of what's going on. You have to listen to it. Stop blaming everything else on a virus or a germ because it's not that. It's futile. So that's polio.
The what I want to mention first before I make my comments here is that The Moth in the Iron Lung is the most phenomenal read on polio. And it is the book that I recommend first for people to get into the terrain because it's written in like story form. It's not like these heavy, what really makes you
Mhm.
ill, like 700 pages of fact, fact, fact. Like it's an easy read. What really makes you ill is a fantastic read, by the way, not to diminish it, but it's big and it's
Yeah,
like,
and
there's this
it's like a Bible though. It's hard to
it's
read.
like a Bible. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great reference book. But with The Moth and the Iron Lung, it tells the story from the beginning, back in the 1800s when it all began. And you can see the cases, they clustered in little country towns that were testing out these pesticides. And it told the story of like cows being dipped in lead arsenate water to get the all the bugs off them. It's amazing. They would take the cows and they would literally walk them into a ditch of this water full of these heavy metals. And then they would go and feed that cow, or the that farm that was doing that practice would probably feed, 100 families, and then boom, you got 100 cases of polio. You know
Yep.
what I mean? All the children that are really susceptible to heavy metals were getting polio in these and it was very um isolated events of this polio. And obviously they didn't call it polio in the early days, but it talks about this changing nature of uh I want to say diagnostics, but categorizing this illness. And even now, when you see these neurological conditions like meningitis, you'll see three cases. Like we saw three cases in a rural
Mhm.
town in Nova Scotia. Why were they all on the same street? Why were all the kids that got meningitis from the exact same place, drinking the same water, probably eating the same food from the same places, doing the same activities? They literally, a couple of them grew up on the same street. It's so interesting that that happens. And so it's really like, and it's like that for everything. It's like, you go to India and you'll see that all the cases are from some little rural town where they're still illegally using DDT because, yeah, they banned DDT in India, but they
Yeah.
still use it. They still use it a lot. They use it
Still
illegally
use it.
because guess what we did with all of our DDT when we banned it? Shipped it to the third world countries. Boom. Great way to get rid of it. What are they
Exactly.
going to do with it?
Exactly.
What are they going to do with it? Are they just going to throw it out? No, they're not going to throw it out. First of all, if they do throw it out, they're just going to put it in their water and then drink it anyways. So it's like, what are they going to do? Are they
Hmm.
going to waste these pesticides that they glorify the first world countries are using? It's a really it's an interesting thing that you can sort of look into there. But with polio, even in the height of polio, it was still very isolated. Like it wasn't like COVID where it went around the whole world and everyone got it all at the same time. It was like it was still very isolated. It wasn't a pandemic; it was an epidemic. So it's
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
interesting to see, like when you study like it specifically, to see the isolated nature. It's very interesting, and it doesn't really make sense for the theory of an infectious illness. Like it doesn't really follow the predictions
Exactly.
that should have taken place. And look at the graphs. The graphs are hilarious. You look at like when DDT was used, like began to be used. It was like 1939. What happened after 1939? Boom, it skyrocketed. And then okay, so they started testing the virus on millions of Canadians, and I think it was Canadians and people from England. Why people from England, right? Anyways, people and so then boom, the cases peaked, and then the vaccine was introduced, and then we changed the definition and all this stuff. And that again is another thing that I think was sort of understated here. But like Jacob did mention it, we're reclassifying the symptoms into newer illnesses: Epstein-Barr, meningitis types. There's a plethora of different ways you could take it, but it's getting reclassified. So that's why we're not seeing polio cases in Canada, because in our minds we've successfully eradicated polio. But then you go to the third world countries where they may not adhere as strictly to the parameters being used in, you know, Canada and the United States. So they are diagnosing polio because they were like, wow, these fit the exact description of the symptoms of polio. So you could see how it sort of gets misconstrued here and misunderstood. So The Moth and the Iron Lung, fantastic, fantastic read, especially as a first read getting into the terrain. It tells a beautiful story, and it tells you a lot about a lot of these cases that popped up, especially in the early years. It'll be like this farms started using lead acetate or lead arsenate, and boom, a little bit
Yeah.
later, there's a little polio outbreak in this town. They don't call it polio, but there's a bunch of people getting paralyzed with the exact symptoms, right? So it's really interesting to see that. I really want to stress that book is a fantastic read. The other thing within the science, Jacob obviously did an amazing job covering the fraud and the science side of things there. One thing that I find interesting is that when you take polio tissue, right? So if polio, let's assume that polio is caused by heavy metals, which clearly seems to be the case. If the tissues are concentrating these heavy metals, because heavy metals do have an affinity for neurological symptoms, if you grind up the spinal tissue of an individual who is paralyzed, that spinal tissue is going to be full of heavy metals. So you're also adding heavy metals when you're adding polio tissue, right? So that's an interesting sort of confounding variable that's not accounted for whatsoever. And you see that, I think I'm gonna have to cut Jacob off here and not go over tuberculosis, but we're gonna save that for another episode. But it's the same as as tuberculosis when they cut the tuberculosis nodules off, the little concentrations of
Dude.
tuberculosis, they're little concentrations of toxicity. The body's trying to store that away from like the heart or the tissues. So it creates little, it's kind of what cancer does as well, is like creates a tumor to sort of store all that toxicity. So there's a big confounding variable because you're in tuberculosis. Sorry to get back on track there for my little aside. You know, you're grinding up these concentrations of toxicity and then introducing that into guinea pigs alongside other toxicity, of course, but it's still compounding variables that are not considered whatsoever in science that should be discussed realistically. If we're going to be objective about this sort of stuff, this should be mentioned in the discussion sections, but obviously it's not, because it would take away from the narrative that's being told that it is virus, it is this, it is that. An interesting thing that you can do, which pretty well always holds true, is that if you go and read a scientific paper and you replace the word virus with its original meaning, toxin, all the studies make sense.
Exactly.
If you replace the word virus in all these studies and you just read it as toxin, it's like, wow, they're actually bang on about this sort of stuff. It is toxicity, it's air toxicity. If there is any sort of contagion, it's toxicity in the environment. It's like, it's kind of funny how you could sort of switch that, but that's where, the understanding of the true meaning of the word
Yeah.
virus, because virus has been around for a long time, but it meant toxin. It didn't mean self-replicating particle, blah, whatever
Yes,
nonsense
exactly.
you want to make
And
up.
what you mentioned in the beginning with exactly, you mentioned it with the beginning of Lyme disease, how people they want to know what our stance would be with the cause of these sort of things, and that goes back to just understanding what a toxin is. And I see it in your comments, I see it in my comments, I see it in others, where people are like, "What do you mean by toxin? What do you mean? What is a toxin?" And toxin is simply something that usually is not part of the natural form of life, humans, earth, that will negatively affect the homeostasis of your health. That is it. It brings things out of balance. It is harmful to you, and primarily man made most of the time. Man made toxins are the primary reason we are in this mess in our health. Of course, you have the odd, tornado or whatever, but a tornado isn't a toxin. It's just a weather phenomenon. A toxin is heavy metal in an injection being put directly into your blood. That's a toxin. EMF, even though we're utilizing electromagnetic fields right now when I'm talking to Leave, it is a toxin. It is because it's not natural. It's literally fake waves that we created as man, and there are thousands of studies showing that EMF leads to so many different pathologies. Do we care? Unfortunately, as a society, no, because we're using it for YouTube, for IG, for Facebook, whatever, and we really should be more mindful of it. Limiting your toxicity. If these people back then got their got their meat from straight up pasture raised organic farms that did not use DDT, they would not have developed polio, which is a huge point to you need to take care of where you're sourcing your food from, of your environment, and that is going to be the main predicate on whether or not you're going to be healthy. Because again, polio, insert virus, COVID, whatever the hell. It's all toxicity, as Leaf said. It's literally all toxicity. And of course, you have the science that is then bending the test results to make things bigger than they actually are. That's all it is. And we
But
just got to be
Jacob,
more mindful
I
of what
think
we're putting in our
you're
body and exposing our body to.
I think you're involved in a appeal to nature logical fallacy here. I think you're appealing to nature that all is nature is and all that is unnatural is unhealthy. Actually, go back and read the original mention of the
Oh,
appeal to nature logical fallacy, and you'll see that you're trying to ascribe morality to nature. That is the nature of the logical fallacy. It is not a logical fallacy to say that what is unnatural is unhealthy, because health and disease are not moral endeavors either. Nature is not a moral endeavor. We don't view disease processes as negative or bad. They're obviously undesirable. I don't think anybody in the world would disagree with that, but we're not saying that they're bad. Actually, we would say that disease processes are good because it's the body healing itself, it's the
it's a
body bringing
good
itself
thing.
back into balance. So go and read the original paper on appeal to nature logical fallacy, and you're wrong. Every time I've heard anybody tell me that I'm appealing to nature, they have no understanding about this logical fallacy. First of all, it's a logical fallacy that was invented in the early 1900s, so it's only 100 years old, which, again, is not saying that it's necessarily bad, but it's not an original logical fallacy, and it has all to do with morality and nothing to do with health and disease. So, and he talks about health
Mm,
for a very long time and talks about how these are not included in this logical fallacy because health and disease, again, you cannot ascribe morality to that. Morals are a human endeavor. We ascribe morality to everything around us. It's a human
yeah,
endeavor, sure, but if we're going to talk objectively about nature and toxicity and disease, it is not an appeal to nature. That is my parting
no.
words on that, Mr. Diaz. Anything else you want to add, my friend?
No, man, I can't wait for the tuberculosis episode because yeah, I mean that's another one too. But all diseases really, I mean, people may be tired of it or not. It's all the same theme here.
All the
It's
same.
caused by a toxin of some sort, usually man-made. They blame a germ because it's around the area. They do crappy experiments, like when Coke, like you mentioned it, when Coke would literally take tuberculous crusty matter and just shove it into animal brains and whatever, and then some of them get sick and he's like, oh yo, I just proved a contagion. It's that, and then it's the drugs to make a profit. It's the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, whenever that's ready, I'm down. But yeah, parting words. Your health is your decision. Germs don't cause disease. Viruses don't exist. Cope. That's it.
Mic drop. Mic drop. Yeah, we'll do tuberculosis. I think maybe we'll do monkeypox with that one. That's a big trend now too. That could be a little fun. I've been kind
Oh
of
yeah.
diving a little deeper into
Oh
that.
yeah.
We'll talk more about that after. But yeah, I mean, amazing. Jacob Diaz, everybody, again, back on the pod. He's awesome. He's got to come on here more, honestly. This guy is a fountain of knowledge. He's got an amazing
Oh yeah.
podcast, too. He covered the topics we spoke about today. Again, that Lyme podcast just came out. This one's coming out on Monday. That one already came out. Go check that one out. Go check out the tuberculosis episode. Check out the polio episode. Uh, he's got an episode on water. He's got to check out his Instagram too. He's delved deep into a lot of different illnesses with a beautiful terrain perspective. Instagram. He's on Twitter a little bit there. Instagram's probably the best place. Am I missing anything here, man, or what?
No, you got it all good. Yeah, Instagram definitely the best. Yeah, I really need. I should use Twitter more often, like you do. I got to do it. I just hate. I just hate the app. But it's the people, bro. It's the people. It's the
People,
people that are
man.
on your comments. They're all, dude. Can't
It's the
the
people.
appeal? Oh, what?
Oh well.
What do you know? You're just a bro. The appeal to authority is my favorite. That's the one
That
they
is a
always
good
go
one.
to.
It's a good
Uh,
one.
yeah, and the ad hominem is just funny because they just say whatever they want. So it is what it
Nonsense,
is.
bro. No logic whatsoever. That's the common theme that you see with the germ theory. And I appreciate the terrain movement so much. It's really what got me into logic and studying it in depth. And I think that's an important foundation when you're talking about anything. I debate empiricism and rationalism a lot. I know there's flaws with empiricism. I don't think that it's useless, but I think that it should be coupled with pure logic and rationalism point of view too.
Mm.
If something is going to be empirically sound, it should stand up to a proper logical argument, you know. So there's no reason that we can't use both. It's you're going to cover all your bases. Honestly, it's a debate, empiricism versus
Mhm.
rationalism, blah blah blah. I mean, maybe when it comes to psychology, there's no room for empiricism because you're dealing with human nature. Same as economics, you can go read about that. You know, there is no room for empiricism in economics or psychology, in my opinion. But when it comes to the natural sciences, you could probably use a little bit of both. Like, but you need to use logic. And the germ theorists, you know, and scientists in general, the modern scientists, just it just has no logic. And it's sad. It's a sad sight, you know. There's no philosophy, there's no logic, there's no spirituality. It's just pure materialism, and it's sort of a sad way to look at the world, in my opinion. That's my moral judgment there. To interject that, Mr. Diaz, thank you so much for coming on. I so much appreciate your time. This has been so much fun. I just love talking to you, man.
Same thing, bro. Same thing. Keep it up, man. We're the next generation.
100%. Awesome. All right. I want to thank you all for listening. You should all know this is not medical advice or scientific advice. Everything Jacob Diaz and I say is complete nonsense, and don't listen to us. This is for your informational purposes only. But also remember that we're all responsible, sovereign beings capable of thinking, criticizing, and understanding absolutely anything. We're together self healers, self forces, or with the greatest forces, messing up the outro here a little bit. We're self healers, self governable, self teachers, so much more. You know, this is the autonomy that Jacob's speaking about. We can do everything ourselves, you know. Community, not necessarily self reliance, but communal reliance. Rely on your friends, family, loved ones. You don't really need much more than that. Please reach out if you have any questions, criticisms, comments, concerns. We'll probably answer your questions in some sort of format, so make sure you do that. Instagram's the best place to reach us both. Listen, I really appreciate y'all for taking the time to listen today. I love this episode. Like, I love these episodes with Jacob. It's just so much fun. I can't wait to listen back to it. If you did like it, give us a like, share, comment, subscribe, review, whatever you got to do on the platform that you're on. You know what to do. And just remember, there are two types of people in this world: those believe they can, those believe they can't, and they are both correct. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Take care.